Blackstone Audio presents Basic Economics, A Common Sense Guide to the Economy by Thomas Sowell. This book is read by Tom Weiner. A few lines of reasoning can change the way we see the world. Stephen E. Landsberg. Preface. The most obvious difference between this book and other introductory economics books is that basic economics has no graphs or equations. It is also written in plain English, rather than in economic jargon, so that it can be readily understood by people with no previous knowledge of economics. This includes both the general public and beginning students in economics. A less obvious but important feature of basic economics is that it uses real-life examples from countries around the world to make economic principles vivid and memorable, in a way that graphs and equations might not. Through its various editions, the fundamental idea behind basic economics has remained the same. Learning economics should be as uncomplicated as it is eye-opening. Readers' continuing interest in these new editions at home, and a growing number of translations into foreign languages overseas, suggest that there is a widespread desire for this kind of introduction to economics when it is presented in a readable way. Just as people do, this book has put on weight with the passing years, as new chapters have been added and existing chapters updated and expanded to stay abreast of changing developments in economies around the world. Readers who have been puzzled by the large disparities in economic development and standards of living among the nations of the world will find a new chapter, Chapter 23, the longest chapter in the book, devoted to exploring geographic, demographic, cultural, and other reasons why such striking disparities have existed for so long. It also examines factors which are said to have been major causes of international economic disparities, and finds that the facts do not always support such claims. Most of us are necessarily ignorant of many complex fields, from botany to brain surgery. As a result, we simply do not attempt to operate in or comment on those fields. However, every voter and every politician that they vote for affects economic policies. We cannot opt out of economic issues and decisions. Our only options are to be informed, uninformed, or misinformed when making our choices on issues and candidates. Basic economics is intended to make it easier to be informed. The fundamental principles of economics are not hard to understand, but they are easy to forget, especially amid the heady rhetoric of politics and the media. In keeping with the nature of basic economics as an introduction to economics, not only have jargon, graphs, and equations been left out, so have the usual endnotes. However, those who wish to check up on some of the surprising facts they will learn here can find the sources listed on my website, www.tsowell.com, or on a website established by the publisher, SowellBasicEconomics.com. Thomas Sowell, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Chapter 1. What is economics? Whether one is a conservative or a radical, a protectionist or a free trader, a cosmopolitan or a nationalist, a churchman or a heathen, it is useful to know the causes and consequences of economic phenomena. George J. Stigler. Economic events often make headlines in the newspapers or breaking news on television. Yet it is not always clear from these news stories what caused these particular events, much less what future consequences can be expected. The underlying principles involved in most economic events are usually not very complicated in themselves, but the political rhetoric and economic jargon in which they are discussed can make these events seem murky. Yet the basic economic principles that would clarify what is happening may remain unknown to most of the public and little understood by many in the media. These basic principles of economics apply around the world and have applied for over thousands of years of recorded history. They apply in many very different kinds of economies, capitalist, socialist, feudal, or whatever, and among a wide variety of peoples, cultures, and governments. Policies which led to rising price levels under Alexander the Great have led to rising price levels in America thousands of years later. Rent control laws have led to a very similar set of consequences in Cairo, Hong Kong, Stockholm, Melbourne, and New York. So have similar agricultural policies in India and in the European Union countries. We can begin the process of understanding economics by first being clear as to what economics means. To know what economics is, we must first know what an economy is. Perhaps most of us think of an economy as a system for the production and distribution of the goods and services we use in everyday life. That is true as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough. The Garden of Eden was a system for the production and distribution of goods and services, but it was not an economy because everything was available in unlimited abundance. Without scarcity, there is no need to economize, and therefore no economics. A distinguished British economist named Lionel Robbins gave a classic definition of economics. Economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. Scarcity. What does scarce mean? It means that what everybody wants adds up to more than there is. This may seem like a simple thing, but its implications are often grossly misunderstood, even by highly educated people. For example, a feature article in the New York Times laid out the economic woes and worries of middle-class Americans, one of the most affluent groups of human beings ever to inhabit this planet. Although this story included a picture of a middle-class American family in their own swimming pool, the main headline read, "The American Middle, Just Getting By." Other headings in the article included, "Wishes Deferred and Plans Unmet," "Goals That Remain Just Out of Sight," "Dogged Saving and Some Luxuries." In short, middle-class Americans' desires exceed what they can comfortably afford, even though what they already have would be considered unbelievable prosperity by people in many other countries around the world, or even by earlier generations of Americans. Yet both they and the reporter regarded them as just getting by, and a Harvard sociologist was quoted as saying, "How budget-constrained these people really are." But it is not something as man-made as a budget which constrains them. Reality constrains them. There has never been enough to satisfy everyone completely. That is the real constraint. That is what scarcity means. The New York Times reported that one of these middle-class families got in over their heads in credit card spending, but then got their finances in order. "But if we make a wrong move," Geraldine Fraser said, "the pressure we had from the bills will come back, and that is painful." To all these people, from academia and journalism, as well as the middle-class people themselves, it apparently seemed strange somehow that there should be such a thing as scarcity, and that this should imply a need for both productive efforts on their part and personal responsibility in spending the resulting income. Yet nothing has been more pervasive in the history of the human race than scarcity, and all the requirements for economizing that go with scarcity. Regardless of our policies, practices, or institutions, whether they are wise or unwise, noble or ignoble, there is simply not enough to go around to satisfy all our desires to the fullest. Unmet needs are inherent in these circumstances, whether we have a capitalist, socialist, feudal, or other kind of economy. These various kinds of economies are just different institutional ways of making trade-offs that are inescapable in any economy. Productivity. Economics is not just about dealing with the existing output of goods and services as consumers. It is also, and more fundamentally, about producing that output from scarce resources in the first place, turning inputs into output. In other words, economics studies the consequences of decisions that are made about the use of land, labor, capital, and other resources that go into producing the volume of output which determines a country's standard of living. Those decisions and their consequences can be more important than the resources themselves, for there are poor countries with rich natural resources and countries like Japan and Switzerland with relatively few natural resources but high standards of living. The values of natural resources per capita in Uruguay and Venezuela are several times what they are in Japan and Switzerland, but real income per capita in Japan and Switzerland is more than double that of Uruguay and several times that of Venezuela. Not only scarcity, but also alternative uses are at the heart of economics. If each resource had only one use, economics would be much simpler. But water can be used to produce ice or steam by itself, or innumerable mixtures and compounds in combination with other things. Similarly, from petroleum comes not only gasoline and heating oil, but also plastics, asphalt, and Vaseline. Iron ore can be used to produce steel products ranging from paper clips to automobiles to the frameworks of skyscrapers. How much of each resource should be allocated to each of its many uses? Every economy has to answer that question, and each one does, in one way or another, efficiently or inefficiently. Doing so efficiently is what economics is about. Different kinds of economies are essentially different ways of making decisions about the allocation of scarce resources, and those decisions have repercussions on the life of the whole society. During the days of the Soviet Union, for example, that country's industries used more electricity than American industries used, even though Soviet industries produced a smaller amount of output than American industries produced. Such inefficiencies in turning inputs into outputs translated into a lower standard of living in a country richly endowed with natural resources, perhaps more richly endowed than any other country in the world. Russia is, for example, one of the few industrial nations that produces more oil than it consumes. But an abundance of resources does not automatically create an abundance of goods. Efficiency in production, the rate at which inputs are turned into output, is not just some technicality that economists talk about. It affects the standard of living of whole societies. When visualizing this process, it helps to think about the real things, the iron ore, petroleum, wood, and other inputs that go into the production process and the furniture, food, and automobiles that come out the other end, rather than think of economic decisions as being simply decisions about money. Although the word economics suggests money to some people, for a society as a whole, money is just an artificial device to get real things done. Otherwise, the government could make us all rich by simply printing more money. It is not money, but the volume of goods and services, which determines whether a country is poverty-stricken or prosperous. The role of economics. Among the misconceptions of economics is that it is something that tells you how to make money or run a business, or predict the ups and downs of the stock market. But economics is not personal finance or business administration, and predicting the ups and downs of the stock market has yet to be reduced to a dependable formula. When economists analyze prices, wages, profits, or the international balance of trade, for example, it is from the standpoint of how decisions in various parts of the economy affect the allocation of scarce resources in a way that raises or lowers the material standard of living of the people as a whole. Economics is not simply a topic on which to express opinions or vent emotions. It is a systematic study of cause and effect, showing what happens when you do specific things in specific ways. In economic analysis, the methods used by a Marxist economist like Oskar Lange did not differ in any fundamental way from the methods used by a conservative economist like Milton Friedman. It is these basic economic principles that this book is about. One of the ways of understanding the consequences of economic decisions is to look at them in terms of the incentives they create, rather than simply the goals they pursue. This means that consequences matter more than intentions, and not just the immediate consequences, but also the longer-run repercussions. Nothing is easier than to have good intentions, but without an understanding of how an economy works, good intentions can lead to counterproductive or even disastrous consequences for a whole nation. Many, if not most, economic disasters have been a result of policies intended to be beneficial, and these disasters could often have been avoided if those who originated and supported such policies had understood economics. While there are controversies in economics, as there are in science, this does not mean that the basic principles of economics are just a matter of opinion, any more than the basic principles of chemistry or physics are just a matter of opinion. Einstein's analysis of physics, for example, was not just Einstein's opinion. As the world discovered at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Economic reactions may not be as spectacular or as tragic as of a given day, but the worldwide depression of the 1930s plunged millions of people into poverty, even in the richest countries, producing malnutrition in countries with surplus food, probably causing more deaths around the world than those at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Conversely, when India and China, historically two of the poorest nations on earth, began in the late 20th century to make fundamental changes in their economic policies, their economies began growing dramatically. It has been estimated that 20 million people in India rose out of destitution in a decade. In China, the number of people living on $1 a day or less fell from 374 million, one-third of the country's population in 1990, to 128 million by 2004, now just 10% of a growing population. In other words, nearly 250 million Chinese were now better off as a result of a change in economic policy. Things like this are what makes the study of economics important, and not just a matter of opinions or emotions. Economics is a tool of cause and effect analysis, a body of tested knowledge and principles derived from that knowledge. Money doesn't even have to be involved to make a decision be economic. When a military medical team arrives on a battlefield where soldiers have a variety of wounds, they are confronted with the classic economic problem of allocating scarce resources which have alternative uses. Almost never are there enough doctors, nurses, or paramedics to go around, nor enough medications. Some of the wounded are near death and have little chance of being saved, while others have a fighting chance if they get immediate care, and still others are only slightly wounded and will probably recover whether they get immediate attention or not. If the medical team does not allocate its time and medications efficiently, some wounded soldiers will die needlessly, while time is being spent attending to others not as urgently in need of care, or still others whose wounds are so devastating that they will probably die in spite of anything that can be done for them. It is an economic problem, though not a dime changes hands. Most of us hate even to think of having to make such choices. Indeed, as we have already seen, some middle-class Americans are distressed at having to make much milder choices and trade-offs. But life does not ask us what we want, it presents us with options. Economics is one of the ways of trying to make the most of those options. Part 1. Prices and Markets. Chapter 2. The Role of Prices. The wonder of markets is that they reconcile the choices of myriad individuals. William Easterly. Since we know that the key task facing any economy is the allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses, the next question is, how does an economy do that? Different kinds of economies obviously do it differently. In a feudal economy, the lord of the manor simply told the people under him what to do and where he wanted resources put. Grow less barley and more wheat, put fertilizer here, more hay there, drain the swamps. It was much the same story in 20th century communist societies, such as the Soviet Union, which organized a far more complex modern economy in much the same way, with the government issuing orders for a hydroelectric dam to be built on the Volga River, for so many tons of steel to be produced in Siberia, so much wheat to be grown in the Ukraine. By contrast, in a market economy coordinated by prices, there is no one at the top to issue orders to control or coordinate activities throughout the economy. How an incredibly complex, high-tech economy can operate without any central direction is baffling to many. The last president of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, is said to have asked British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, "How do you see to it that people get food?" The answer was that she didn't. Prices did that. Moreover, the British people were better fed than people in the Soviet Union, even though the British have not produced enough food to feed themselves in more than a century. Prices bring them food from other countries. Without the role of prices, imagine what a monumental bureaucracy it would take to see to it that the city of London alone is supplied with the tons of food of every variety which it consumes every day. Yet such an army of bureaucrats can be dispensed with, and the people that would be needed in such a bureaucracy can do productive work elsewhere in the economy because the simple mechanism of prices does the same job faster, cheaper, and better. This is also true in China, where the communists still run the government, but by the early 21st century, were allowing free markets to operate in much of that country's economy. Although China has 1/5 of the total population of the world, it has only 10% of the world's arable land, so feeding its people could continue to be the critical problem that it once was, back in the days when recurring famines took millions of lives each in China. Today, prices attract food to China from other countries. China's food supplement is coming from abroad, from South America, the U.S., and Australia. This means prosperity for agricultural traders and processors like Archer Daniels Midland. They're moving into China in all of the ways you'd expect, in a $100 billion national market for processed food that's growing more than 10% annually. It means a windfall for farmers in the American Midwest, who are enjoying soybean prices that have risen about 2/3 from what they were a year ago. It means a better diet for the Chinese, who have raised their caloric intake by 1/3 in the past quarter century. Given the attractive power of prices, the American fried chicken company KFC was by the early 21st century making more sales in China than in the United States. China's per capita consumption of dairy products nearly doubled in just 5 years. A study estimated that 1/4 of the adults in China were overweight, not a good thing in itself, but a heartening development in a country once afflicted with recurring famines. Economic decision-making. The fact that no given individual or set of individuals controls or coordinates all the innumerable economic activities in a market economy does not mean that these things just happen randomly or chaotically. Each consumer, producer, retailer, landlord, or worker makes individual transactions with other individuals on whatever terms they can mutually agree on. Prices convey those terms, not just to the particular individuals immediately involved, but throughout the whole economic system, and indeed throughout the world. If someone else, somewhere else, has a better product or a lower price for the same product or service, that fact gets conveyed and acted upon through prices, without any elected official or planning commission having to issue orders to consumers or producers. Indeed, faster than any planners could assemble the information on which to base their orders. If someone in Fiji figures out how to manufacture better shoes at lower costs, it will not be long before you are likely to see those shoes on sale at attractive prices in the United States or in India or anywhere in between. After the Second World War ended, Americans could begin buying cameras from Japan, whether or not officials in Washington were even aware at that time that the Japanese made cameras. Given that any modern economy has millions of products, it is too much to expect the leaders of any country to even know what all those products are, much less know how much of each resource should be allocated to the production of each of those millions of products. Prices play a crucial role in determining how much of each resource gets used where, and how the resulting products get transferred to millions of people. Yet this role is seldom understood by the public, and it is often disregarded entirely by politicians. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in her memoirs said that Mikhail Gorbachev had little understanding of economics, even though he was at the time the leader of the largest nation on earth. Unfortunately, he was not unique in that regard. The same could be said of many other national leaders around the world, in countries large and small, democratic or undemocratic. In countries where prices coordinate economic activities automatically, that lack of knowledge of economics does not matter nearly as much as in countries where political leaders try to direct and coordinate economic activities. Many people see prices as simply obstacles to their getting the things they want. Those who would like to live in a beachfront home, for example, may abandon such plans when they discover how extremely expensive beachfront property can be. But high prices are not the reason we cannot all live in beachfront houses. On the contrary, the inherent reality is that there are not nearly enough beachfront homes to go around, and prices simply convey that underlying reality. When many people bid for a relatively few homes, those homes become very expensive because of supply and demand. But it is not the prices that cause the scarcity. There would be the same scarcity under feudalism or socialism or in a tribal society. If the government today were to come up with a plan for universal access to beachfront homes and put caps on the prices that could be charged for such property, that would not change the underlying reality of the extremely high ratio of people to beachfront land. With a given population and a given amount of beachfront property, rationing without prices would have to take place by bureaucratic fiat, political favoritism, or random chance, but the rationing would still have to take place. Even if the government were to decree that beachfront homes were a basic right of all members of society, that would still not change the underlying scarcity in the slightest. Prices are like messengers conveying news, sometimes bad news, in the case of beachfront property desired by far more people than can possibly live at the beach, but often also good news. For example, computers have been getting both cheaper and better at a very rapid rate as a result of technological advances. Yet the vast majority of beneficiaries of those high-tech advances have not the foggiest idea of just what specifically those technological changes are. But prices convey to them the end results, which are all that matter for their own decision-making and their own enhanced productivity and general well-being from using computers. Similarly, if vast new rich iron ore deposits were suddenly discovered somewhere, perhaps no more than 1% of the population would be likely to be aware of it, but everyone would discover that things made of steel were becoming cheaper. People thinking of buying desks, for example, would discover that steel desks had become more of a bargain compared to wooden desks, and some would undoubtedly change their minds as to which kind of desk to purchase because of that. The same would be true when comparing various other products made of steel to competing products made of aluminum, copper, plastic, wood, or other materials. In short, price changes would enable a whole society, indeed consumers around the world, to adjust automatically to a greater abundance of known iron ore deposits, even if 99% of those consumers were wholly unaware of the new discovery. Prices are not just ways of transferring money. Their primary role is to provide financial incentives to affect behavior in the use of resources and their resulting products. Prices not only guide consumers, they guide producers as well. When all is said and done, producers cannot possibly know what millions of different consumers want. All that automobile manufacturers, for example, know is that when they produce cars with a certain combination of features, they can sell those cars for a price that covers their production costs and leaves them a profit. But when they manufacture cars with a different combination of features, these don't sell as well. In order to get rid of the unsold cars, the sellers must cut the prices to whatever level is necessary to get them off the dealers' lots, even if that means taking a loss. The alternative would be to take a bigger loss by not selling them at all. Although a free market economic system is sometimes called a profit system, it is in reality a profit and loss system, and the losses are equally important for the efficiency of the economy because losses tell producers what to stop doing, what to stop producing, where to stop putting resources, what to stop investing in. Losses force the producers to stop producing what consumers don't want. Without really knowing why consumers like one set of features rather than another, producers automatically produce more of what earns a profit and less of what is losing money. That amounts to producing what the consumers want and stopping the production of what they don't want. Although the producers are only looking out for themselves and their company's bottom line, nevertheless, from the standpoint of the economy as a whole, the society is using its scarce resources more efficiently because decisions are guided by prices. Prices formed a worldwide web of communication long before there was an internet. Prices connect you with anyone, anywhere in the world where markets are allowed to operate freely, so that places with the lowest prices for particular goods can sell those goods around the world. As a result, you can end up wearing shirts made in Malaysia, shoes produced in Italy, and slacks made in Canada, while driving a car manufactured in Japan, rolling on tires produced in France. Price-coordinated markets enable people to signal to other people how much they want and how much they are willing to offer for it, while other people signal what they are willing to supply in exchange for what compensation. Prices responding to supply and demand cause natural resources to move from places where they are abundant, like Australia, to places where they are almost non-existent, like Japan. The Japanese are willing to pay higher prices than Australians pay for those resources. These higher prices will cover shipping costs and still leave a larger profit than selling the same resources within Australia, where their abundance makes their prices lower. A discovery of large bauxite deposits in India would reduce the cost of aluminum baseball bats in America. A disastrous failure of the wheat crop in Argentina would raise the incomes of farmers in Ukraine, who would now find more demand for their wheat in the world market and therefore higher prices. When more of some item is supplied than demanded, competition among sellers trying to get rid of the excess will force the price down, discouraging future production, with the resources used for that item being set free for use in producing something else that is in greater demand. Conversely, when the demand for a particular item exceeds the existing supply, rising prices due to competition among consumers encourage more production, drawing resources away from other parts of the economy to accomplish that. The significance of free market prices in the allocation of resources can be seen more clearly by looking at situations where prices are not allowed to perform this function. During the era of the government-directed economy of the Soviet Union, for example, prices were not set by supply and demand, but by central planners who sent resources to their various uses by direct commands, supplemented by prices that the planners raised or lowered as they saw fit. Two Soviet economists, Nikolai Shmelev and Vladimir Popov, described a situation in which their government raised the price it would pay for moleskins, leading hunters to get and sell more of them. State purchases increased, and now all the distribution centers are filled with these pelts. Industry is unable to use them all, and they often rot in warehouses before they can be processed. The Ministry of Light Industry has already requested Goskompson twice to lower purchasing prices, but the question has not been decided yet. And this is not surprising. Its members are too busy to decide. They have no time. Besides setting prices on these pelts, they have to keep track of another 24 million prices. However overwhelming it might be for a government agency to try to keep track of 24 million prices, a country with more than 100 million people can far more easily keep track of those prices individually, because no given individual or enterprise has to keep track of more than the relatively few prices that are relevant to their own decision-making. The overall coordination of these innumerable isolated decisions takes place through the effect of supply and demand on prices and the effect of prices on the behavior of consumers and producers. Money talks, and people listen. Their reactions are usually faster than central planners could get their reports together. While telling people what to do might seem to be a more rational or orderly way of coordinating an economy, it has turned out repeatedly to be far less effective in practice. The situation as regards pelts was common for many other goods during the days of the Soviet Union's centrally planned economy, where a chronic problem was a piling up of unsold goods in warehouses at the very time when there were painful shortages of other things that could have been produced with the same resources. In a market economy, the prices of surplus goods would fall automatically by supply and demand, while the prices of goods in short supply would rise automatically for the same reason, the net result being a shifting of resources from the former to the latter, again automatically, as producers seek to gain profits and avoid losses. The problem was not that particular planners made particular mistakes in the Soviet Union or in other planned economies. Whatever the mistakes made by central planners, there are mistakes made in all kinds of economic systems, capitalist, socialist, or whatever. The more fundamental problem with central planning has been that the task taken on has repeatedly proven to be too much for human beings, in whatever country that task has been taken on. As Soviet economists Shmelev and Popov put it, no matter how much we wish to organize everything rationally, without waste, no matter how passionately we wish to lay all the bricks of the economic structure tightly, with no chinks in the mortar, it is not yet within our power. Prices and costs. Prices in a market economy are not simply numbers plucked out of the air or arbitrarily set by sellers. While you may put whatever price you wish on the goods or services you provide, those prices will become economic realities only if others are willing to pay them. And that depends not on whatever prices you have chosen, but on how much consumers want what you offer, and on what prices other producers charge for the same goods and services. Even if you produce something that would be worth $100 to a customer and offer it for sale at $80, that customer will still not buy it from you if another producer offers the same thing for $70. Obvious as all this may seem, its implications are not at all obvious to some people, those who blame high prices on greed, for example, for that implies that a seller can set prices at will and make sales at those arbitrary prices. For example, a front-page newspaper story in the Arizona Republic began, "Greed drove metropolitan Phoenix's home prices and sales to new records in 2005. Fear is driving the market this year." This implies that lower prices meant less greed, rather than changed circumstances that reduced the seller's ability to charge the same prices as before and still make sales. The changed circumstances in this case included the fact that homes for sale in Phoenix remained on the market longer before being sold than during the year before, and the fact that home builders were struggling to sell even deeply discounted new homes. There was not the slightest indication that sellers were any less interested in getting as much money as they could for the houses they sold, that is, that they were any less greedy. Competition in the market is what limits how much anyone can charge and still make sales. So what is at issue is not anyone's disposition, whether greedy or not, but what the circumstances of the market cause to happen. A seller's feelings, whether greedy or not, tell us nothing about what the buyer will be willing to pay. Resource allocation by prices. We now need to look more closely at the process by which prices allocate scarce resources that have alternative uses. The situation where the consumers want product A and don't want product B is the simplest example of how prices lead to efficiency in the use of scarce resources. But prices are equally important in more common and more complex situations, where consumers want both A and B, as well as many other things, some of which require the same ingredients in their production. For example, consumers not only want cheese, they also want ice cream and yogurt, as well as other products made from milk. How do prices help the economy to determine how much milk should go to each of these products? In paying for cheese, ice cream, and yogurt, consumers are in effect also bidding indirectly for the milk from which these products are produced. In other words, money that comes in from the sales of these products is what enables the producers to again buy milk to use to continue making their respective products. When the demand for cheese goes up, cheesemakers use their additional revenue to bid away some of the milk that before went into making ice cream or yogurt in order to increase the output of their own product to meet the rising demand. When the cheesemakers demand more milk, this increased demand forces up the price of milk to everyone, including the producers of ice cream and yogurt. As the producers of these other products raise the prices of ice cream and yogurt to cover the higher cost of the milk that goes into them, consumers are likely to buy less of these other dairy products at these higher prices. How will each producer know just how much milk to buy? Obviously, they will buy only as much milk as will repay its higher costs from the higher prices of these dairy products. If consumers who buy ice cream are not as discouraged by rising prices as consumers of yogurt are, then very little of the additional milk that goes into making more cheese will come from a reduced production of ice cream, and more will come from a reduced production of yogurt. What this all means as a general principle is that the price which one producer is willing to pay for any given ingredient becomes the price that other producers are forced to pay for that same ingredient. This applies whether we are talking about the milk that goes into making cheese, ice cream, and yogurt, or we are talking about the wood that goes into making baseball bats, furniture, and paper. If the amount of paper demanded doubles, this means that the demand for wood pulp to make paper goes up. As the price of wood rises in response to this increased demand, that in turn means that the prices of baseball bats and furniture will have to go up, in order to cover the higher costs of the wood from which they are made. The repercussions go further. As the price of milk rises, dairies have incentives to produce more milk, which can mean buying more cows, which in turn can mean that more cows will be allowed to grow to maturity instead of being slaughtered for meat as calves. Nor do the repercussions stop there. As fewer cows are slaughtered, there is less cowhide available, and the prices of baseball gloves can rise because of supply and demand. Such repercussions spread throughout the economy, much as waves spread across a pond when a stone drops into the water. No one is at the top coordinating all of this, mainly because no one would be capable of following all these repercussions in all directions. Such a task has proven to be too much for central planners in country after country. Incremental substitution. Since scarce resources have alternative uses, the value placed on one of these uses by one individual or company sets the cost that has to be paid by others who want to bid some of these resources away for their own use. From the standpoint of the economy as a whole, this means that resources tend to flow to their most valued uses when there is price competition in the marketplace. This does not mean that one use categorically precludes all other uses. On the contrary, adjustments are incremental. Only that amount of milk which is as valuable to ice cream consumers or consumers of yogurt as it is to cheese purchasers will be used to make ice cream or yogurt. Only that amount of wood which is as valuable to the makers of baseball bats or furniture as it is to the producers of paper will be used to make bats and furniture. Now look at the demand from the consumer's standpoint. Whether considering consumers of cheese, ice cream, or yogurt, some will be anxious to have a certain amount, less anxious to have additional amounts, and finally, beyond some point, indifferent to having any more, or even unwilling to consume any more after becoming satiated. The same principle applies when more wood pulp is used to make paper and the producers and consumers of furniture and baseball bats have to make their incremental adjustments accordingly. In short, prices coordinate the use of resources, so that only that amount is used for one thing which is equal in value to what it is worth to others in other uses. That way, a price-coordinated economy does not flood people with cheese to the point where they are sick of it, while others are crying out in vain for more ice cream or yogurt. Absurd as such a situation would be, it has happened many times in economies where prices are not used to allocate scarce resources. Pelts were not the only unsaleable goods that were piling up in Soviet warehouses, while people were waiting in long lines trying to get other things that were in short supply. The efficient allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses is not just some abstract notion of economists. It determines how well or how badly millions of people live. Again, as in the example of beachfront property, prices convey an underlying reality. From the standpoint of society as a whole, the cost of anything is the value that it has in alternative uses. That cost is reflected in the market when the price that one individual is willing to pay becomes a cost that others are forced to pay in order to get a share of the same scarce resource or the products made from it. But no matter whether a particular society has a capitalist price system or a socialist economy or a feudal or other system, the real cost of anything is still its value in alternative uses. The real cost of building a bridge is whatever else could have been built with that same labor and material. This is also true at the level of a given individual, even when no money is involved. The cost of watching a television sitcom or soap opera is the value of the other things that could have been done with that same time. Economic systems. Different economic systems deal with this underlying reality in different ways and with different degrees of efficiency, but the underlying reality exists independently of whatever particular kind of economic system happens to exist in a given society. Once we recognize that, we can then compare how economic systems which use prices to force people to share scarce resources among themselves differ in efficiency from economic systems which determine such things by having kings, politicians, or bureaucrats issue orders saying who can get how much of what. During a brief era of greater openness in the last years of the Soviet Union, when people became more free to speak their minds, the two Soviet economists already mentioned wrote a book giving a very candid account of how their economy worked, and this book was later translated into English. As Shmulov and Popov put it, production enterprises in the Soviet Union always ask for more than they need from the government in the way of raw materials, equipment, and other resources used in production. They take everything they can get, regardless of how much they actually need, and they don't worry about economizing on materials, according to these economists. After all, nobody at the top knows exactly what the real requirements are, so squandering made sense from the standpoint of the manager of a Soviet enterprise. Among the resources that were squandered were workers. These economists estimated that from 5 to 15% of the workers in the majority of enterprises are surplus and are kept just in case. The consequence was that far more resources were used to produce a given amount of output in the Soviet economy as compared to a price-coordinated economic system such as that in Japan, Germany, and other market economies. Citing official statistics, Shmelov and Popov lamented, "To make 1 ton of copper, we use about 1,000 kilowatt-hours of electrical energy, as against 300 in West Germany. To produce 1 ton of cement, we use twice the amount of energy that Japan does." The Soviet Union did not lack for resources, but was in fact one of the most richly endowed nations on earth, if not the most richly endowed in natural resources. Nor was it lacking in highly educated and well-trained people. What it lacked was an economic system that made efficient use of its resources. Because Soviet enterprises were not under the same financial constraints as capitalist enterprises, they acquired more machines than they needed, which then gather dust in warehouses or rust out of doors, as the Soviet economists put it. In short, Soviet enterprises were not forced to economize, that is, to treat their resources as both scarce and valuable in alternative uses, for the alternative users were not bidding for those resources, as they would in a market economy. While such waste cost individual Soviet enterprises little or nothing, they cost the Soviet people dearly, in the form of a lower standard of living than their resources and technology were capable of producing. Such a waste of inputs as these economists described could not, of course, continue in the kind of economy where these inputs would have to be purchased in competition with alternative users, and where the enterprise itself could survive only by keeping its costs lower than its sales receipts. In such a price-coordinated capitalist system, the amount of inputs ordered would be based on the enterprise's most accurate estimate of what was really required, not on how much its managers could persuade higher government officials to let them have. These higher officials could not possibly be experts on all the wide range of industries and products under their control, so those with the power in the central planning agencies were to some extent dependent on those with the knowledge of their own particular industries and enterprises. This separation of power and knowledge was at the heart of the problem. Central planners could be skeptical of what the enterprise managers told them, but skepticism is not knowledge. If resources were denied, production could suffer, and heads could roll in the central planning agencies. The net result was the excessive use of resources described by the Soviet economists. The contrast between the Soviet economy and the economies of Japan and Germany is just one of many that can be made between economic systems which use prices to allocate resources and those which have relied on political or bureaucratic control. In other regions of the world as well, and in other political systems, there have been similar contrasts between places that used prices to ration goods and allocate resources versus places that have relied on hereditary rulers, elected officials, or appointed planning commissions. When many African colonies achieved national independence in the 1960s, a famous bet was made between the president of Ghana and the president of the neighboring Ivory Coast as to which country would be more prosperous in the years ahead. At that time, Ghana was not only more prosperous than the Ivory Coast, it had more natural resources, so the bet might have seemed reckless on the part of the president of the Ivory Coast. However, he knew that Ghana was committed to a government-run economy and the Ivory Coast to a freer market. By 1982, the Ivory Coast had so surpassed Ghana economically that the poorest 20% of its people had a higher real income per capita than most of the people in Ghana. This could not be attributed to any superiority of the country or its people. In fact, in later years, when the government of the Ivory Coast eventually succumbed to the temptation to control more of their country's economy, while Ghana finally learned from its mistakes and began to loosen government controls on the market, these two countries' roles reversed. And now Ghana's economy began to grow, while that of the Ivory Coast declined. Similar comparisons could be made between Burma and Thailand, the former having had the higher standard of living before instituting socialism, and the latter a much higher standard of living afterwards. Other countries, India, Germany, China, New Zealand, South Korea, Sri Lanka, have experienced sharp upturns in their economies when they freed those economies from many government controls and relied more on prices to allocate resources. As of 1960, India and South Korea were at comparable economic levels, but by the late 1980s, South Korea's per capita income was 10 times that in India. India remained committed to a government-controlled economy for many years after achieving independence in 1947. However, in the 1990s, India jettisoned 4 decades of economic isolation and planning and freed the country's entrepreneurs for the first time since independence, in the words of the distinguished London magazine The Economist. There followed a new growth rate of 6% a year, making it one of the world's fastest-growing big economies. From 1950 to 1990, India's average growth rate had been 2%. The cumulative effect of growing 3 times as fast as before was that millions of Indians rose out of poverty. In China, the transition to a market economy began earlier, in the 1980s. Government controls were at first relaxed on an experimental basis in particular economic sectors and in particular geographic regions earlier than in others. This led to stunning economic contrasts within the same country, as well as rapid economic growth overall. Back in 1978, less than 10% of China's agricultural output was sold in open markets, instead of being turned over to the government for distribution. But by 1990, 80% was sold directly in the market. The net result was more food and a greater variety of food available to city dwellers in China, and a rise in farmers' income by more than 50% within a few years. In contrast to China's severe economic problems when there was heavy-handed government control under Mao, who died in 1976, the subsequent freeing up of prices in the marketplace led to an astonishing economic growth rate of 9% per year between 1978 and 1995. While history can tell us that such things happened, economics helps explain why they happened. What there is about prices that allows them to accomplish what political control of an economy can seldom match. There is more to economics than prices, but understanding how prices function is the foundation for understanding much of the rest of economics. A rationally planned economy sounds more plausible than an economy coordinated only by prices, linking millions of separate decisions by individuals and organizations. Yet Soviet economists who saw the actual consequences of a centrally planned economy reached very different conclusions. Namely, there are far too many economic relationships, and it is impossible to take them all into account and coordinate them sensibly. Knowledge is one of the most scarce of all resources, and a pricing system economizes on its use by forcing those with the most knowledge of their own particular situation to make bids for goods and resources based on that knowledge, rather than on their ability to influence other people in planning commissions, legislatures, or royal palaces. However much articulation may be valued by intellectuals, it is not nearly as efficient a way of conveying accurate information as confronting people with a need to put your money where your mouth is. That forces them to summon up their most accurate information, rather than their most plausible words. Human beings are going to make mistakes in any kind of economic system. The key question is, what kinds of incentives and constraints will force them to correct their own mistakes? In a price-coordinated economy, any producer who uses ingredients which are more valuable elsewhere in the economy is likely to discover that the costs of those ingredients cannot be repaid from what the consumers are willing to pay for the product. After all, the producer has had to bid those resources away from alternative users, paying more than the resources are worth to some of those alternative users. If it turns out that these resources are not more valuable in the uses to which this producer puts them, then he is going to lose money. There will be no choice but to discontinue making that product with those ingredients. For those producers who are too blind or too stubborn to change, continuing losses will force their businesses into bankruptcy, so that the waste of the resources available to the society will be stopped that way. That is why losses are just as important as profits from the standpoint of the economy, even though losses are not nearly as popular with businesses. In a price-coordinated economy, employees and creditors insist on being paid, regardless of whether the managers and owners have made mistakes. This means that capitalist businesses can make only so many mistakes for so long before they have to either stop or get stopped, whether by an inability to get the labor and supplies they need or by bankruptcy. In a feudal economy or a socialist economy, leaders can continue to make the same mistakes indefinitely. The consequences are paid by others in the form of a standard of living lower than it would be if there were greater efficiency in the use of scarce resources. In the absence of compelling price signals and the threat of financial losses to the producers that they convey, inefficiency and waste in the Soviet Union could continue until such time as each particular instance of waste reached proportions big enough and blatant enough to attract the attention of central planners in Moscow, who were preoccupied with thousands of other decisions. Ironically, the problems caused by trying to run an economy by direct orders or by arbitrarily imposed prices created by government fiat were foreseen in the 19th century by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, whose ideas the Soviet Union claimed to be following. Engels pointed out that price fluctuations have forcibly brought home to the individual commodity producers what things and what quantity of them society requires or does not require. Without such a mechanism, he demanded to know what guarantee we have that necessary quantity and not more of each product will be produced, that we shall not go hungry in regard to corn and meat while we are choked in beet sugar and drowned in potato spirit, that we shall not lack trousers to cover our nakedness while trouser buttons flood us in millions. Marx and Engels apparently understood economics much better than their latter-day followers, or perhaps Marx and Engels were more concerned with economic efficiency than with maintaining political control from the top. There were also Soviet economists who understood the role of price fluctuations in coordinating any economy. Near the end of the Soviet Union, two of these economists, Shmelov and Popov, whom we have already quoted, said, "Everything is interconnected in the world of prices, so that the smallest change in one element is passed along the chain to millions of others." These Soviet economists were especially aware of the role of prices, from having seen what happened when prices were not allowed to perform that role. But economists were not in charge of the Soviet economy. Political leaders were. Under Stalin, a number of economists were shot for saying things he did not want to hear. Supply and demand. There is perhaps no more basic or more obvious principle of economics than the fact that people tend to buy more at a lower price and less at a higher price. By the same token, people who produce goods or supply services tend to supply more at a higher price and less at a lower price. Yet the implications of these two simple principles, singly or in combination, cover a remarkable range of economic activities and issues, and contradict an equally remarkable range of misconceptions and fallacies. Demand versus need. When people try to quantify a country's need for this or that product or service, they are ignoring the fact that there is no fixed or objective need. Seldom, if ever, is there a fixed quantity demanded. For example, communal living in an Israeli kibbutz was based on its members collectively producing and supplying each other with goods and services, without resort to money or prices. However, supplying electricity and food without charging prices led to a situation where people often did not bother to turn off electric lights during the day, and members would bring friends from outside the kibbutz to join them for meals. But after the kibbutz began to charge prices for electricity and food, there was a sharp drop in the consumption of both. In short, there was no fixed quantity of need or demand for food or electricity, despite how indispensable both might be. Likewise, there is no fixed supply. Statistics on the amount of petroleum, iron ore, or other natural resources seem to indicate that this is just a simple matter of how much physical stuff there is in the ground. In reality, The costs of discovery, extraction, and processing of natural resources vary greatly from one place to another. There is some oil that can be extracted and processed from some places for $20 a barrel, and other oil elsewhere that cannot repay all its production costs at $40 a barrel, but which can at $60 a barrel. With goods in general, the quantity supplied varies directly with the price, just as the quantity demanded varies inversely with the price. When the price of oil falls below a certain point, low-yield oil wells are shut down because the cost of extracting and processing the oil from those particular wells would exceed the price that the oil would sell for in the market. If the price later rises, or if the cost of extraction or processing is lowered by some new technology, then such oil wells will be put back into operation again. Certain sands containing oil in Venezuela and in Canada had such low yields that they were not even counted in the world's oil reserves until oil prices hit new highs in the early 21st century. That changed things. As the Wall Street Journal reported, these deposits were once dismissed as unconventional oil that couldn't be recovered economically, but now, thanks to rising global oil prices and improved technology, most oil industry experts count oil sands as recoverable reserves. That recalculation has vaulted Venezuela and Canada to first and third in global reserves rankings. The Economist magazine likewise reported, Canada's oil sands, or tar sands as the GU is known, are outsized in every way. They contain 174 billion barrels of oil that can be recovered profitably, and another 141 billion that might be worth exploiting if the oil price rises or the costs of extraction decrease, enough to give Canada bigger oil reserves than Saudi Arabia. In short, there is no fixed supply of oil, or of most other things. In some ultimate sense, the Earth has a finite amount of each resource, but even when that amount may be enough to last for centuries or millennia, at any given time, the amount that is economically feasible to extract and process varies directly with the price for which it can be sold. Many false predictions over the past century or more that we were running out of various natural resources in a few years were based on confusing the economically available current supply at current prices with the ultimate physical supply in the Earth, which is often vastly greater. Natural resources are not the only things that will be supplied in greater quantities when their prices rise. That is true of many commodities and even workers. When people project that there will be a shortage of engineers or teachers or food in the years ahead, they usually either ignore prices or implicitly assume that there will be a shortage at today's prices. But shortages are precisely what cause prices to rise. At higher prices, it may be no harder to fill vacancies for engineers or teachers than today, and no harder to find food, as rising prices cause more crops to be grown and more livestock to be raised. In short, a larger quantity is usually supplied at higher prices than at lower prices, whether what is being sold is oil or apples, lobsters or labor. Real value. The producer whose product turns out to have the combination of features that are closest to what the consumers really want may be no wiser than his competitors. Yet he can grow rich, while his competitors who guessed wrong go bankrupt. But the larger result is that society as a whole gets more benefits from its limited resources by having them directed toward where those resources produce the kind of output that millions of people want, instead of producing things that they don't want. Simple as all this may seem, it contradicts many widely held ideas. For example, not only are high prices often blamed on greed, people often speak of something being sold for more than its real value, or of workers being paid less than they are really worth, or of corporate executives, athletes, and entertainers being paid more than they are really worth. The fact that prices fluctuate over time and occasionally have a sharp rise or a steep drop misleads some people into concluding that prices are deviating from their real values. But their usual level under usual conditions is no more real or valid than their much higher or much lower levels under different conditions. When a large employer goes bankrupt in a small community or simply moves away to another region or country, Many of the business's former employees may decide to move away themselves from a place that now has fewer jobs, and when their numerous homes go on sale in the same small area at the same time, the prices of those houses are likely to be driven down by competition. But this does not mean that people are selling their homes for less than their real value. The value of living in that particular community has simply declined with the decline of job opportunities, and housing prices reflect this underlying fact. The most fundamental reason why there is no such thing as an objective or real value is that there would be no rational basis for economic transactions if there were. When you pay $1 for a newspaper, obviously the only reason you do so is that the newspaper is more valuable to you than the dollar is. At the same time, the only reason people are willing to sell the newspaper is that $1 is more valuable to them than the newspaper is. If there were any such thing as a real or objective value of a newspaper, or anything else, neither the buyer nor the seller would benefit from making a transaction at a price equal to that objective value, since what would be acquired would be of no greater value than what was given up. In that case, why bother to make the transaction in the first place? On the other hand, if either the buyer or the seller was getting more than the objective value from the transaction, then the other person must be getting less, in which case, why would the other party continue making such transactions while being continually cheated? Continuing transactions between buyer and seller make sense only if value is subjective, each getting what is worth more subjectively. Economic transactions are not a zero-sum process, where one person loses whatever the other person gains. Competition. Competition is the crucial factor in explaining why prices usually cannot be maintained at arbitrarily set levels. Competition is the key to the operation of a price-coordinated economy. It not only forces prices toward equality, it likewise causes capital, labor, and other resources to flow toward where their rates of return are highest, that is, where the unsatisfied demand is greatest, until the returns are evened out through competition, much like water seeking its own level. However, the fact that water seeks its own level does not mean that the ocean has a glassy, smooth surface. Waves and tides are among the ways in which water seeks its own level, without being frozen indefinitely at a given level. Similarly, in an economy, the fact that prices and rates of return on investments tend to equalize means only that their fluctuations, relative to one another, are what move resources from places where their earnings are lower to where their earnings are higher, that is, from where the quantity supplied is greatest relative to the quantity demanded, to where there is the most unsatisfied demand. It does not mean that prices remain the same over time, or that some ideal pattern of allocation of resources remains the same indefinitely. Prices and supplies. Prices not only ration existing supplies, they also act as powerful incentives to cause supplies to rise or fall in response to changing demand. When a crop failure in a given region creates a sudden increase in demand for imports of food into that region, food suppliers elsewhere rush to be the first to get there in order to capitalize on the high prices that will prevail until more supplies arrive and drive food prices back down again through competition. What this means, from the standpoint of the hungry people in that region, is that food is being rushed to them at maximum speed by greedy suppliers, probably much faster than if the same food were being transported to them by salaried government employees sent on a humanitarian mission. Those spurred on by a desire to earn top dollar for the food they sell may well drive throughout the night or take shortcuts over rough terrain, while those operating in the public interest are more likely to proceed at a less hectic pace and by safer or more comfortable routes. In short, people tend to do more for their own benefit than for the benefit of others. Freely fluctuating prices can make that turn out to be beneficial to others. In the case of food supplies, earlier arrival can be the difference between temporary hunger and death by starvation, or by diseases to which people are more susceptible when they are undernourished. Where there are local famines in third world countries, it is not at all uncommon for food supplied by international agencies to the national government to sit spoiling on the docks while people are dying of hunger inland. However unattractive greed may be, It is likely to move food much faster, saving more lives. In other situations, the consumers may not want more but less. Prices also convey this. When automobiles began to displace horses and buggies in the early 20th century, the demand for saddles, horseshoes, carriages, and other such paraphernalia declined. As the manufacturers of such products faced losses instead of profits, many began to abandon their businesses or were forced to shut down by bankruptcy. In a sense, it is unfair when some people are unable to earn as much as others with similar levels of skills and diligence because of innovations which were as unforeseen by most of the producers who benefited as by most of the producers who were made worse off. Yet this unfairness to particular individuals and businesses is what makes the economy as a whole operate more efficiently for the benefit of vastly larger numbers of others. Would creating more fairness among producers, at the cost of reduced efficiency and a resulting lower standard of living, be fair to consumers? The gains and losses are not isolated or independent events. The crucial role of prices is in tying together a vast network of economic activities among people too widely scattered to all know each other. However much we may think of ourselves as independent individuals, we are all dependent on other people for our very lives, as well as being dependent on innumerable strangers who produce the amenities of life. Few of us could grow the food we need to live, much less build a place to live in, or produce such things as computers or automobiles. Other people have to be induced to create all these things for us, and economic incentives are crucial for that purpose. As Will Rogers once said, "We couldn't live a day without depending on everybody." Prices make that dependence viable by linking their interests with ours. Unmet needs. One of the most common, and certainly one of the most profound misconceptions of economics, involves unmet needs. Politicians, journalists, and academicians are almost continuously pointing out unmet needs in our society that should be supplied by some government program or other. Most of these things are things that most of us wish our society had more of. What is wrong with that? Let us go back to square one. If economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses, then it follows that there will always be unmet needs. Some particular desires can be singled out and met 100%, but that only means that other desires will be even more unfulfilled than they are now. Anyone who is driven in most big cities will undoubtedly feel that there is an unmet need for more parking spaces. But while it is both economically and technologically possible to build cities in such a way as to have a parking space available for anyone who wants one, anywhere in the city, at any hour of the day or night, does it follow that we should do it? The cost of building vast new underground parking garages, or of tearing down existing buildings to create parking garages above ground, or of designing new cities with fewer buildings and more parking lots, would all be astronomically costly. What other things are we prepared to give up in order to have this automotive utopia? Fewer hospitals? Less police protection? Fewer fire departments? Are we prepared to put up with even more unmet needs in these areas? Maybe some would give up public libraries in order to have more places to park. But whatever choices are made, and however it is done, there will still be more unmet needs elsewhere, as a result of meeting an unmet need for more parking spaces. We may differ among ourselves as to what is worth sacrificing in order to have more of something else. The point here is more fundamental. Merely demonstrating an unmet need is not sufficient to say that it should be met, not when resources are scarce and have alternative uses. In the case of parking spaces, what might appear to be cheaper, when measured only by government expenditures, would be to restrict or forbid the use of private automobiles in cities, adjusting the number of cars to the number of existing parking spaces, instead of vice versa. Moreover, passing and enforcing such a law would cost a tiny fraction of the cost of greatly expanding the number of parking spaces. But this saving in government expenditures would have to be weighed against the vast private expenditures currently devoted to the purchase, maintenance, and parking of automobiles in cities. Obviously, these expenditures would not have been undertaken in the first place if those who pay these prices did not find the benefits to be worth it to them. To go back to square one again, costs are foregone opportunities, not government expenditures. Forcing thousands of people to forego opportunities for which they have willingly paid vast amounts of money is a cost that may far outweigh the money saved by not having to build more parking spaces or do the other things necessary to accommodate cars in cities. None of this says that we should have either more parking spaces or fewer parking spaces in cities. What it says is that the way this issue and many others is presented makes no sense in a world of scarce resources which have alternative uses. That is a world of trade-offs, not solutions, and whatever trade-off is decided upon will still leave unmet needs. So long as we respond gullibly to political rhetoric about unmet needs, we will arbitrarily choose to shift resources to whatever the featured unmet need of the day happens to be, and away from other things. Then, when another politician, or perhaps even the same politician at a later time, discovers that robbing Peter to pay Paul has left Peter worse off, and now wants to help Peter meet his unmet needs, we will start shifting resources in another direction. In short, we will be like a dog chasing his tail in a circle and getting no closer, no matter how fast he runs. This is not to say that we have the ideal trade-offs already and should leave them alone. Rather, it says that whatever trade-offs we make or change should be seen from the outset as trade-offs, not meeting unmet needs. The very word needs arbitrarily puts some desires on a higher plane than others, as categorically more important. But however urgent it may be to have some food and some water, for example, in order to sustain life itself, nevertheless, beyond some point, both become not only unnecessary but even counterproductive and dangerous. Widespread obesity among Americans shows that food has already reached that point, and anyone who has suffered the ravages of flood, even if it is only a flooded basement, knows that water can reach that point as well. In short, even the most urgently required things remain necessary only within a given range. We cannot live half an hour without oxygen, but even oxygen beyond some concentration level can promote the growth of cancer and has been known to make newborn babies blind for life. There is a reason why hospitals do not use oxygen tanks willy-nilly. In short, nothing is a need categorically, regardless of how urgent it may be to have particular amounts at particular times and places. Unfortunately, most laws and government policies apply categorically, if only because of the dangers in leaving every government official to become a petty despot in interpreting what these laws and policies mean and when they should apply. In this context, calling something a need categorically is playing with fire. Many complaints that some basically good government policy has been applied stupidly may fail to address the underlying problem of categorical laws in an incremental world. There may not have been any intelligent way to apply categorically a policy designed to meet desires whose benefits vary incrementally and ultimately cease to be benefits. By its very nature as a study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses, economics is about incremental trade-offs, not about needs or solutions. That may be why economists have never been as popular as politicians, who promise to solve our problems and meet our needs. Chapter 3. Price Controls. The record of price controls goes as far back as human history. They were imposed by the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. They were decreed by Hammurabi, king of Babylon, in the 18th century B.C. They were tried in ancient Athens. Henry Hazlitt. Nothing makes us understand the many roles of electricity in our lives like a power failure. Similarly, nothing shows more vividly the role and importance of price fluctuations in a market economy than the absence of such price fluctuations when the market is controlled. What happens when prices are not allowed to fluctuate freely according to supply and demand, but instead their fluctuations are fixed within limits set by law under various kinds of price controls? Typically, price controls are imposed in order to keep prices from rising to the levels that they would reach in response to supply and demand. The political rationales for such laws have varied from place to place and from time to time, but there is seldom a lack of rationales whenever it becomes politically expedient to hold down some people's prices in the interest of other people whose political support seems more important. To understand the effects of price control, it is first necessary to understand how prices rise and fall in a free market. There is nothing esoteric about it, but it is important to be very clear about what happens. Prices rise because the amount demanded exceeds the amount supplied at existing prices. Prices fall because the amount supplied exceeds the amount demanded at existing prices. The first case is called a shortage, and the second is called a surplus, but both depend on existing prices. Simple as this might seem, it is often misunderstood, sometimes with disastrous consequences. Price ceilings and shortages. When there is a shortage of a product, there is not necessarily any less of it, either absolutely or relative to the number of consumers. During and immediately after the Second World War, for example, there was a very serious housing shortage in the United States, even though the country's population and its housing supply had both increased by about 10% from their pre-war levels, and there was no shortage when the war began. In other words, even though the ratio between housing and people had not changed, nevertheless, many Americans looking for an apartment during this period had to spend weeks or months in an often futile search for a place to live, or else resorted to bribes to get landlords to move them to the top of waiting lists. Meanwhile, they doubled up with relatives, slept in garages, or used other makeshift living arrangements, such as buying military surplus Quonset huts or old trolley cars to live in. Although there was no less housing space per person than before the war, the shortage was very real and very painful at existing prices, which were kept artificially lower than they would have been because of rent control laws that had been passed during the war. At these artificially low prices, more people had a demand for more housing space than before rent controls were enacted. This is a practical consequence of the simple economic principle already noted in Chapter 2, that the quantity demanded varies according to how high or how low the price is. When some people used more housing than usual, other people found less housing available. The same thing happens under other forms of price control. Some people use the price-controlled goods or services more generously than usual because of the artificially lower price, and as a result, other people find that less than usual remains available for them. There are other consequences to price controls in general, and rent control provides examples of these as well. Demand under rent control. Some people who would normally not be renting their own apartments, such as young adults still living with their parents, or some single or widowed elderly people living with relatives, were enabled by the artificially low prices created by rent control to move out and into their own apartments. These artificially low prices also caused others to seek larger apartments than they would ordinarily be living in, or to live alone when they would otherwise have to share an apartment with a roommate in order to be able to afford the rent. Some people who do not even live in the same city as their rent-controlled apartment nevertheless keep it as a place to stay when they are visiting the city. Hollywood movie stars who kept rent-controlled apartments in New York, or a couple living in Hawaii who kept a rent-controlled residence in San Francisco, for example. More tenants seeking both more apartments and larger apartments create a shortage, even when there is not any greater physical scarcity of housing relative to the total population. When rent control ended after World War II, the housing shortage quickly disappeared. After rents rose in a free market, some childless couples living in 4-bedroom apartments could decide that they would live in 2-bedroom apartments and save the difference in rent. Some late teenagers could decide that they would continue living with their parents a little longer, until their pay rose enough for them to be able to afford their own apartment, now that rent was no longer artificially cheap. The net result was that families looking for a place to stay found more places available, now that rent control laws were no longer keeping such places occupied by people with less urgent requirements. In other words, the housing shortage immediately eased, even before there was time for new housing to be built, in response to market conditions that now made it possible to recover the cost of building more housing and earn a profit. Just as price fluctuations allocate scarce resources which have alternative uses, price controls which limit those fluctuations reduce the incentives for individuals to limit their own use of scarce resources desired by others. Rent control, for example, tends to lead to many apartments being occupied by just one person. A study in San Francisco showed that 49% of that city's rent-controlled apartments had only a single occupant, while a severe housing shortage in the city had thousands of people living considerable distances away and making long commutes to their jobs in San Francisco. Meanwhile, a census report showed likewise that 46% of all households in Manhattan, where nearly half of all apartments are under some form of rent control, are occupied by only one person, compared to 27% nationwide. In the normal course of events, people's demand for housing space changes over a lifetime. Their demand for space usually increases when they get married and have children. But years later, after the children have grown up and moved away, the parents' demand for space may decline, and it often declines yet again after a spouse dies and the widow or widower moves into smaller quarters or goes to live with relatives or in an institution for the elderly. In this way, a society's total stock of housing is shared and circulated among people according to their changing individual demands at different stages of their lives. This sharing takes place not because the individuals themselves have a sense of cooperation, but because of the prices, rents in this case, which confront them. In a free market, these prices are based on the value that other tenants put on housing. Young couples with a growing family are often willing to bid more for housing, even if that means buying fewer consumer goods and services, in order to have enough money to pay for additional housing space. A couple who begin to have children may cut back on how often they go out to restaurants or to movies, or they may wait longer to buy new clothes or a new car, in order that each child may have his or her own bedroom. But once the children are grown and gone, such sacrifices may no longer make sense, when additional other amenities can now be enjoyed by reducing the amount of housing space being rented. Given the crucial role of prices in this process, suppression of that process by rent control laws leaves few incentives for tenants to change their behavior as their circumstances change. Elderly people, for example, have less incentive to vacate apartments that they would normally vacate when their children are gone or after a spouse dies, if that would result in a significant reduction in rent, leaving them more money with which to improve their living standards in other respects. Moreover, the chronic housing shortages which accompany rent control greatly increase the time and effort required to search for a new and smaller apartment, while reducing the financial reward for finding one. In short, rent control reduces the rate of housing turnover. New York City has had rent control longer and more stringently than any other major American city. One consequence has been that the annual rate of turnover of apartments in New York is less than half the national average, and the proportion of tenants who have lived in the same apartment for 20 years or more is more than double the national average. As the New York Times summarized the situation, New York used to be like other cities, a place where tenants moved frequently and landlords competed to rent empty apartments to newcomers. But today the motto may as well be, "No immigrants need apply." While immigrants are crowded into bunks in illegal boarding houses in the slums, upper-middle-class locals pay low rents to live in good neighborhoods, often in large apartments they no longer need after their children move out. Supply under rent control. Rent control has effects on supply as well as on demand. 9 years after the end of World War II, not a single new apartment building had been built in Melbourne, Australia, because of rent control laws there which made such buildings unprofitable. In Egypt, rent control was imposed in 1960. An Egyptian woman who lived through that era and wrote about it in 2006 reported, "The end result was that people stopped investing in apartment buildings, and a huge shortage in rentals and housing forced many Egyptians to live in horrible conditions with several families sharing one small apartment. The effects of the harsh rent control is still felt today in Egypt. Mistakes like that can last for generations." Declines in building construction have likewise followed in the wake of rent control laws elsewhere. After rent control was instituted in Santa Monica, California in 1979, building permits declined to less than 1/10 of what they were just 5 years earlier. A housing study in San Francisco found that 3/4 of its rent-controlled housing was more than half a century old, and 44% of it was more than 70 years old. Although the construction of office buildings, factories, warehouses, and other commercial and industrial buildings requires much of the same kind of labor and materials used to construct apartment buildings, it is not uncommon for many new office buildings to be constructed in cities where very few new apartment buildings are built. Rent control laws often do not apply to industrial or commercial buildings. Thus, even in cities with severe housing shortages, there may be much vacant space in commercial and industrial buildings. Despite a severe housing shortage in New York, San Francisco, and other cities with rent control, a nationwide survey in 2003 found the vacancy rates in buildings used by business and industry to be nearly 12%, the highest in more than 2 decades. This is just one more piece of evidence that housing shortages are a price phenomenon. High vacancy rates in commercial buildings show that there are obviously ample resources available to construct buildings, but rent control keeps those resources from being used to construct apartments, and thereby diverts these resources into constructing office buildings, industrial plants, and other commercial properties. Not only is the supply of new apartment construction less after rent control laws are imposed, even the supply of existing housing tends to decline, as landlords provide less maintenance and repair under rent control, since the housing shortage makes it unnecessary for them to maintain the appearance of their premises in order to attract tenants. Thus, housing tends to deteriorate faster under rent control and to have fewer replacements when it wears out. Studies of rent control in the United States, England, and France have found rent-controlled housing to be deteriorated far more often than non-rent-controlled housing. Typically, the rental housing stock is relatively fixed in the short run, so that a shortage occurs first because more people want more housing at the artificially low price. Later, there may be a real increase in scarcity as well, as rental units deteriorate more rapidly with reduced maintenance, while not enough new units are being built to replace them as they wear out, because new privately built housing can be unprofitable under rent control. Under rent control in England and Wales, for example, privately built rental housing fell from being 61% of all housing in 1947 to being just 14% by 1977. A study of rent control in various countries concluded new investment in private unsubsidized rented housing is essentially non-existent in all the European countries surveyed, except for luxury housing. In short, a policy intended to make housing affordable for the poor has had the net effect of shifting resources toward the building of housing that is affordable only by the affluent or the rich, since luxury housing is often exempt from rent control, just as office buildings and other commercial properties are. Among other things, this illustrates the crucial importance of making a distinction between intentions and consequences. Economic policies need to be analyzed in terms of the incentives they create, rather than the hopes that inspired them. The incentives toward a reduced supply of housing under rent control are especially pronounced when people who have been renting out rooms or apartments in their own homes or bungalows in their backyards decide that it is no longer worth the bother when rents are kept artificially low under rent control laws. In addition, there are often conversions of apartments to condominiums. During 8 years of rent control in Washington during the 1970s, that city's available rental housing stock declined absolutely, from just over 199,000 units on the market to just under 176,000 units. After rent control was introduced in Berkeley, California, the number of private rental housing units available to students at the university there declined by 31% in 5 years. None of this should be surprising, given the incentives created by rent control laws. In terms of incentives, it is likewise easy to understand what happened in England when rent control was extended in 1975 to cover furnished rental units. According to the Times of London, advertisements for furnished rented accommodation in the London Evening Standard plummeted dramatically in the first week after the act came into force and are now running at about 75% below last year's levels. Since furnished rooms are often in people's homes, these represent housing units that are easily withdrawn from the market when the rents no longer compensate for the inconveniences of having renters living with you. The same principle applies where there are small apartment buildings like duplexes, where the owner is also one of the tenants. Within 3 years after rent control was imposed in Toronto in 1976, 23% of all rental units in owner-occupied dwellings were withdrawn from the housing market. Even when rent control applies to apartment buildings where the landlord does not live, eventually the point may be reached where the whole building becomes sufficiently unprofitable that it is simply abandoned. In New York City, for example, many buildings have been abandoned after their owners found it impossible to collect enough rent to cover the costs of services that they are required by law to provide, such as heat and hot water. Such owners have simply disappeared in order to escape the legal consequences of their abandonment, and such buildings often end up vacant and boarded up, though still physically sound enough to house people, if they continue to be maintained and repaired. The number of abandoned buildings taken over by the New York City government over the years runs into the thousands. It has been estimated that there are at least 4 times as many abandoned housing units in New York City as there are homeless people living on the streets there. Homelessness is not due to a physical scarcity of housing, but to a price-related shortage, which is painfully real nonetheless. As of 2013, there were more than 47,000 homeless people in New York City, 20,000 of them children. Such inefficiency in the allocation of resources means that people are sleeping outdoors on the pavement on cold winter nights, some dying of exposure, while the means of housing them already exists, but are not being used because of laws designed to make housing affordable. Once again, this demonstrates that the efficient or inefficient allocation of scarce resources is not just some abstract notion of economists, but has very real consequences, which can even include matters of life and death. It also illustrates that the goal of a law, affordable housing in this case, tells us nothing about its actual consequences. The politics of rent control. Politically, rent control is often a big success, however many serious economic and social problems it creates. Politicians know that there are always more tenants than landlords, and more people who do not understand economics than people who do. That makes rent control laws something likely to lead to a net increase in votes for politicians who pass rent control laws. Often it is politically effective to represent rent control as a way to keep greedy rich landlords from gouging the poor with unconscionable rents. In reality, rates of return on investments in housing are seldom higher than on alternative investments, and landlords are often people of very modest means. This is especially so for owners of small, low-end apartment buildings that are in constant need of repair, the kinds of places where tenants are likely to be low-income people. Many of the landlords with buildings like this are handymen who use their own skills and labor as carpenters or plumbers to repair and maintain the premises, while trying to pay off the mortgage with the rents they collect. In short, the kind of housing likely to be rented by the poor often has owners who are by no means rich. Where rent control laws apply on a blanket basis to all housing in existence as of the time the law goes into effect, even luxurious housing becomes low-rent housing. Then, after the passage of time makes clear that no new housing is likely to be built unless it is exempted from rent control, such exemptions or relaxations of rent control for new housing mean that even new apartments that are very modest in size and quality may rent for far more than older, more spacious and more luxurious apartments that are still under rent control. This non-comparability of rents has been common in European cities under rent control, as well as in New York and other American cities. Similar incentives produce similar results in many different settings. A news story in the Wall Street Journal pointed up this non-comparability of rents under New York City's rent control laws. Les Katz, a 27-year-old acting student and doorman, rents a small studio apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side for $1,200, with 2 roommates. 2 sleep in separate beds in a loft built atop the kitchen, the third on a mattress in the main room. Across town on Park Avenue, Paul Haberman, a private investor, and his wife live in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment with a solarium and 2 terraces. The apartment in an elegant building on the prestigious avenue is worth at least $5,000 a month, real estate professionals say. The couple pay around $350, according to rent records. This example of cheap rent for the affluent or the wealthy under rent control was by no means unique. Ironically, A statistical study indicated that the biggest difference between prices under New York's rent control law and free market prices is in luxury apartments. In other words, the affluent and the wealthy get more economic benefit from rent control than do the poor who are invoked to justify such laws. Meanwhile, city welfare agencies have paid much higher rents than those just mentioned when they housed poverty-stricken families in cramped and roach-infested apartments in rundown hotels. In 2013, the New York Times reported that the city's Department of Homeless Services was spending over $3,000 a month for each threadbare room without a bathroom or kitchen in a single-room occupancy hotel, half of that money going to the landlord for rent, and the other half for security and social services for homeless tenants. The image that rent control protects poor tenants from rich landlords may be politically effective, but often it bears little resemblance to the reality. The people who actually benefit from rent control can be at any income level, and so can those who lose out. It depends on who happens to be on the inside looking out and who happens to be on the outside looking in when such laws are passed. San Francisco's rent control laws are not as old as those in New York City, but they are similarly severe and have produced very similar results. A study published in 2001 showed that more than one-fourth of the occupants of rent-controlled apartments in San Francisco had household incomes of more than $100,000 a year. It should also be noted that this was the first empirical study of rent control commissioned by the city of San Francisco. Since rent control began there in 1979, this means that for more than 2 decades these laws were enforced and extended, with no serious attempt being made to measure their actual economic and social consequences, as distinguished from their political popularity. Ironically, cities with strong rent control laws, such as New York and San Francisco, tend to end up with higher average rents than cities without rent control. Where such laws apply only to rents below some specified level, presumably to protect the poor, builders then have incentives to build only apartments luxurious enough to be priced above the rent control level. Not surprisingly, this leads to higher average rents, and homelessness tends to be greater in cities with rent control, New York and San Francisco again being classic examples. One of the reasons for the political success of rent control laws is that many people accept words as indicators of reality. They believe that rent control laws actually control rents. So long as they believe that, such laws are politically viable, as are other laws that proclaim some apparently desirable goals, whether those goals end up being served or not. Scarcity versus shortage. One of the crucial distinctions to keep in mind is the distinction between an increased scarcity, where fewer goods are available relative to the population, and a shortage as a price phenomenon. Just as there can be a growing shortage without an increased scarcity, so there can be a growing scarcity without a shortage. As already noted, there was a severe housing shortage in the United States during and immediately after the Second World War, even though the ratio of housing to people was the same as it had been before the war, when there was no housing shortage. It is also possible to have the opposite situation, where the actual amount of housing suddenly declines in a given area without any price control, and without any shortage. This happened in the wake of the Great San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. More than half the city's housing supply was destroyed in just 3 days during that catastrophe. Yet there was no housing shortage. When the San Francisco Chronicle resumed publication a month after the earthquake, its first issue contained 64 advertisements of apartments or homes for rent, compared to only 5 ads from people seeking apartments to live in. Of the 200,000 people suddenly made homeless by the earthquake and fire, temporary shelters housed 30,000, and an estimated 75,000 left the city. Still, that left nearly 100,000 people to be absorbed into the local housing market. If the newspapers of that time mentioned no housing shortage, rising prices not only allocate existing housing, they provide incentives for rebuilding and for renters to use less space in the meantime, as well as incentives for those with space in their homes to take in roomers while rents are high. In short, just as there can be a shortage without any greater physical scarcity, so there can be a greater physical scarcity without any shortage. People made homeless by the huge 1906 San Francisco earthquake found housing more readily, than people made homeless by New York's rent control laws that took thousands of buildings off the market. Hoarding. In addition to shortages and quality deterioration under price controls, there is often hoarding, that is, individuals keeping a larger inventory of the price-controlled goods than they would ordinarily under free market conditions, because of the uncertainty of being able to find it in the future. Thus, during the gasoline shortages of the 1970s, motorists were less likely to let their gas tanks get down as low as usual before going to a filling station to buy more gas. Some motorists with their tanks half full would drive into any filling station that happened to have gas and fill up the other half as a precaution. With millions of motorists driving around with their gas tanks more full than usual, vast amounts of gasoline disappeared into individual inventories, leaving less available for sale from the general inventory at filling stations. Thus, a relatively small shortage of gasoline nationally could turn into a very serious problem for those motorists who happened to run out of gas and had to look for a filling station that was open and had gas to sell. The sudden severity of the gasoline shortage, given how little difference there was in the total amount of gasoline produced, baffled many people and produced various conspiracy theories. One of these conspiracy theories was that oil companies had their tankers from the Middle East circling around in the ocean, waiting for a price increase before coming ashore with their cargoes. Although none of these conspiracy theories stood up under scrutiny, there was a kernel of sense behind them, as there usually is behind most fallacies. A severe shortage of gasoline with very little difference in the total amount of gasoline produced meant that there had to be a large amount of gasoline being diverted somewhere. Few of those who created or believed conspiracy theories suspected that the excess was being stored in their own gas tanks, rather than in oil tankers circling in the ocean. This increased the severity of the gasoline shortage because maintaining millions of larger individual inventories of gasoline in cars and trucks was less efficient than maintaining general inventories in filling stations' storage tanks. The feasibility of hoarding varies with different goods, so the effect of price controls also varies. For example, price controls on strawberries might lead to less of a shortage than price controls on gasoline, since strawberries are too perishable to be hoarded for long. Price controls on haircuts or other services may also create less of a shortage, because services cannot be hoarded. That is, you would not get 2 haircuts on the same day if you found a barber with time available, in order to go twice as long before the next haircut, even though barbers might be less available when the price of haircuts was kept down by price controls. Nevertheless, some unlikely things do get hoarded under price controls. For example, under rent control, people may keep an apartment that they seldom use, as some Hollywood stars have kept rent-controlled apartments in Manhattan, where they would stay when visiting New York. Mayor Ed Koch kept his rent-controlled apartment during the entire 12 years when he lived in Gracie Mansion, the official residence of New York's mayor. In 2008, it was revealed that New York Congressman Charles Rangel had 4 rent-controlled apartments, one of which he used as an office. Hoarding is a special case of the more general economic principle that more is demanded at a lower price, and of the corollary that price controls allow lower priority uses to preempt higher priority uses, increasing the severity of the shortages, whether of apartments or of gasoline. Sometimes the reduction in supply under price controls takes forms that are less obvious. Under World War II price controls, Consumer Reports magazine found that 19 out of 20 candy bars that it tested in 1943 were smaller in size than they had been 4 years earlier. Some producers of canned foods let the quality deteriorate, but then sold these lower quality foods under a different label in order to preserve the reputation of their regular brand. Black markets. While price controls make it illegal for buyer and seller to make some transactions on terms that they would both prefer to the shortages that price controls entail, bolder and less scrupulous buyers and sellers make mutually advantageous transactions outside the law. Price controls almost invariably produce black markets, where prices are not only higher than the legally permitted prices, but also higher than they would be in a free market, since the legal risks must also be compensated. While small-scale black markets may function in secrecy, Large-scale black markets usually require bribes to officials to look the other way. In Russia, for example, a local embargo on the shipment of price-controlled food beyond regional boundaries was dubbed the 150-ruble decree, since this was the cost of bribing police to let the shipments pass through checkpoints. Even during the early Soviet period, when operating a black market in food was punishable by death, black markets still existed. As two Soviet economists of a later era put it, even at the height of war communism, speculators and food smugglers, at the risk of their lives, brought as much grain into the cities as all the state purchases made under Prodyavyorska. Statistics on black market activity are by nature elusive, since no one wants to let the whole world know that they are violating the law. However, sometimes there are indirect indications. Under American wartime price controls during and immediately after the Second World War, employment in meatpacking plants declined as meat was diverted from legitimate packing houses into black markets. This often translated into empty meat counters in butcher shops and grocery stores. In many cases, goods in short supply were kept in the back of the store for sale to those people who were willing to offer more than the legal price. Black markets were not always separate operations, but were also a sideline of some otherwise legitimate businesses. As in other cases, however, this was not due simply to an actual physical scarcity of meat, but to its diversion into illegal channels. Within 1 month after price controls were ended, employment in meatpacking plants rose from 93,000 to 163,000, and then rose again to 180,000 over the next 2 months. This nearly doubling of employment in meatpacking plants in just 3 months indicated that meat was clearly no longer being diverted from the packing houses after price controls were ended. In the Soviet Union, where price controls were more pervasive and longer lasting, two Soviet economists wrote of a gray market where people paid additional money for goods and services. Although these illegal transactions are not taken into account by official statistics, the Soviet economists estimated that 83% of the population used these forbidden economic channels. These illegal markets covered a wide range of transactions, including almost half of the repair of apartments, 40% of automobile repairs, and more video sales than in the legal markets. The black market trades almost 10,000 video titles, while the state market offers fewer than 1,000. Quality deterioration. One of the reasons for the political success of price controls is that part of their costs are concealed. Even the visible shortages do not tell the whole story. Quality deterioration, such as already noted in the case of housing, has been common with many other products and services whose prices have been kept artificially low by government fiat. One of the fundamental problems of price control is defining just what it is whose price is being controlled. Even something as simple as an apple is not easy to define because apples differ in size, freshness, and appearance, quite aside from the different varieties of apples. Produce stores and supermarkets spend time, and hence money, sorting out different kinds and qualities of apples, throwing away those that fall below a certain quality that their respective customers expect. Under price control, however, the amount of apples demanded at an artificially low price exceeds the amount supplied, so there is no need to spend so much time and money sorting out apples, as they will all be sold anyway. Some apples that would ordinarily be thrown away under free market conditions may, under price control, be kept for sale to those people who arrive after all the good apples have been sold. As with apartments under rent control, there is less incentive to maintain high quality when everything will sell anyway during a shortage. Some of the most painful examples of quality deterioration have occurred in countries where there are price controls on medical care. At artificially low prices, more people go to doctors' offices with minor ailments like sniffles or skin rashes that they might otherwise ignore, or else might treat with over-the-counter medications, perhaps with a pharmacist's advice. But all this changes when price controls reduce the cost of visits to the doctor's office, and especially when these visits are paid for by the government and are therefore free to the patient. In short, more people make more claims on doctors' time under price control, leaving less time for other people with more serious or even urgent medical problems. Thus, under Britain's government-controlled medical system, A 12-year-old girl was given a breast implant, while 10,000 people waited 15 months or more for surgery. A woman with cancer had her operation postponed so many times that the malignancy eventually became inoperable. The priorities which prices automatically cause individuals to consider are among the first casualties of price controls. A study conducted by the International Agency Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that, among 5 English-speaking countries surveyed, only in the United States was the percentage of patients waiting for elective surgery for more than 4 months in single digits. All the other English-speaking countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, had more than 20% of their patients waiting more than 4 months, with 38% of those in the United Kingdom waiting at least that long. In this group, the United States was the only country without government-set prices for medical treatment. Incidentally, the term elective surgery was not confined to cosmetic surgery or other medically unnecessary procedures, but in this study included cataract surgery, hip replacement, and coronary bypass surgery. Delayed medical treatment is one aspect of quality deterioration when prices are set below the levels that would prevail under supply and demand. The quality of the treatment received is also affected when doctors spend less time per patient. In countries around the world, the amount of time that physicians spend per patient visit has been shorter under government-controlled medical care prices compared to the time spent by physicians where prices are not controlled. Black markets are another common feature of price controls that apply to medical care as to other things. In China and Japan, black markets have taken the form of bribes to doctors to get expedited treatment. In short, whether the product or service has been housing, apples, or medical care, quality deterioration under price control has been common in the most disparate settings. Price floors and surpluses. Just as a price set below the level that would prevail by supply and demand in a free market tends to cause more to be demanded and less to be supplied, creating a shortage at the imposed price, so a price set above the free market level tends to cause more to be supplied than demanded, creating a surplus. Among the tragedies of the Great Depression of the 1930s was the fact that many American farmers simply could not make enough money from the sale of their crops to pay their bills. The prices of farm products fell much more drastically than the prices of the things that farmers bought. Farm income fell from just over $6 billion in 1929 to $2 billion in 1932. As many farmers lost their farms because they could no longer pay the mortgages, and as other farm families suffered privations as they struggled to hang on to their farms and their traditional way of life, the federal government sought to restore what was called parity between agriculture and other sectors of the economy by intervening to keep farm prices from falling so sharply. This intervention took various forms. One approach was to reduce by law the amount of various crops that could be grown and sold, so as to prevent the supply from driving the price below the level that government officials had decided upon. Thus, supplies of peanuts and cotton were restricted by law. Supplies of citrus fruit, nuts, and various other farm products were regulated by local cartels of farmers, backed up by the authority of the Secretary of Agriculture to issue marketing orders and prosecute those who violated these orders by producing and selling more than they were authorized to produce and sell. Such arrangements continued for decades after the poverty of the Great Depression was replaced by the prosperity of the economic boom following World War II, and many of these restrictions continue to this day. These indirect methods of keeping prices artificially high were only part of the story. The key factor in keeping farm prices artificially higher than they would have been under free market supply and demand was the government's willingness to buy up the surpluses created by its control of prices. This they did for such farm products as corn, rice, tobacco, and wheat, among others, and many of these programs continue on to the present as well. Regardless of what group was initially supposed to be helped by these programs, the very existence of such programs benefited others as well, and these new beneficiaries made it politically difficult to end such programs. Even long after the initial conditions had changed, and the initial beneficiaries were now a small part of the constituency politically organized and determined to keep these programs going. Price control in the form of a floor under prices preventing these prices from falling further, produced surpluses as dramatic as the shortages produced by price control in the form of a ceiling preventing prices from rising higher. In some years, the federal government bought more than one-fourth of all the wheat grown in the United States and took it off the market in order to maintain prices at a predetermined level. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, agricultural price support programs led to vast amounts of food being deliberately destroyed, at a time when malnutrition was a serious problem in the United States, and hunger marches were taking place in cities across the country. For example, the federal government bought 6 million hogs in 1933 alone and destroyed them. Huge amounts of farm produce were plowed under in order to keep it off the market and maintain prices at the officially fixed level, while vast amounts of milk were poured down the sewers for the same reason. Meanwhile, many American children were suffering from diseases caused by malnutrition. Still, there was a food surplus. A surplus, like a shortage, is a price phenomenon. A surplus does not mean that there is some excess relative to the people. There was not too much food relative to the population during the Great Depression. The people simply did not have enough money to buy everything that was produced at the artificially high prices set by the government. A very similar situation existed in poverty-stricken India at the beginning of the 21st century, where there was a surplus of wheat and rice under government price supports. The Far Eastern Economic Review reported, India's public stock of food grains is at an all-time high, and next spring it will grow still further to a whopping 80 million tons, or 4 times the amount necessary in case of a national emergency. Yet while that wheat and rice sits idle, in some cases for years, to the point of rotting, millions of Indians don't have enough to eat. A report from India in the New York Times told a very similar story under the headline, Poor in India Starve as Surplus Wheat Rots. Surplus from this year's wheat harvest, bought by the government from farmers, sits moldering in muddy fields here in Punjab state. Some of the previous year's wheat surplus sits untouched too, and the years before that, and the years before that. To the south, in the neighboring state of Rajasthan, villagers ate boiled leaves or discs of bread made from grass seeds in late summer and autumn because they could not afford to buy wheat. One by one, children and adults, as many as 47 in all, wilted away from hunger-related causes, often clutching pained stomachs. A surplus or glut of food in India, where malnutrition is still a serious problem, might seem like a contradiction in terms. But food surpluses under floor prices are just as real as the housing shortages under ceiling prices. In the United States, the vast amount of storage space required to keep surplus crops off the market once led to such desperate expedients as storing these farm products in unused warships, when all the storage facilities on land had been filled to capacity. Otherwise, American wheat would have had to be left outside to rot, as in India. A series of bumper crops in the United States could lead to the federal government's having more wheat in storage than was grown by American farmers all year. In India, it was reported in 2002 that the Indian government was spending more on storage of its surplus produce than on rural development, irrigation, and flood control combined. It was a classic example of misallocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses, especially in a poor country. So long as the market price of the agricultural product covered by price controls stays above the level at which the government is legally obligated to buy it, the product is sold in the market at a price determined by supply and demand. But when there is either a sufficient increase in the amount supplied or a sufficient reduction in the amount demanded, the resulting lower price can fall to a level at which the government buys what the market is unwilling to buy. For example, when powdered milk was selling in the United States for about $2.20 a pound in 2007, it was sold in the market, but when the price fell to 80 cents a pound in 2008, the U.S. Department of Agriculture found itself legally obligated to buy about 112 million pounds of powdered milk at a total cost exceeding $90 million. None of this is peculiar to the United States or to India. The countries of the European Union spent $39 billion in direct subsidies in 2002, and their consumers spent twice as much as that in the inflated food prices created by these agricultural programs. Meanwhile, the surplus food has been sold below cost on the world market, driving down the prices that third world farmers could get for their produce. In all these countries, not only the government but also the consumers are paying for agricultural price support programs, the government directly in payments to farmers and storage companies, and the consumers in inflated food prices. As of 2001, American consumers were paying $1.9 billion a year in artificially higher prices just for products containing sugar, while the government was paying $1.4 million per month just to store the surplus sugar. Meanwhile, the New York Times reported that sugar producers were big donors to both Republicans and Democrats, and that the costly sugar price support program had bipartisan support. Sugar producers are even more heavily subsidized in the European Union countries than in the United States, and the price of sugar in these countries is among the highest in the world. In 2009, the New York Times reported that sugar subsidies in the European Union were so lavish it even prompted cold-weather Finland to start producing more sugar, even though sugar can be produced from cane grown in the tropics for much lower costs than from sugar beets grown in Europe. In 2002, the U.S. Congress passed a farm subsidy bill that was estimated to cost the average American family more than $4,000 over the following decade in taxes and inflated food prices. Nor was this a new development. During the mid-1980s, when the price of sugar on the world market was 4 cents a pound, the wholesale price within the United States was 20 cents a pound. The government was subsidizing the production of something that Americans could have gotten cheaper by not producing it at all and buying it from countries in the tropics. This has been true of sugar for decades. Moreover, sugar is not unique in this respect, nor is the United States. In the nations of the European Union, the prices of lamb, butter, and sugar are all more than twice as high as their world market prices. As a writer for the Wall Street Journal put it, every cow in the European Union gets more subsidies per day than most sub-Saharan Africans have to live on. Although the original rationale for the American price support programs was to save family farms, in practice, more of the money went to big agricultural corporations, some of which received millions of dollars each, while the average farm received only a few $100s. Most of the money from the 2002 bipartisan farm bill will likewise go to the wealthiest 10% of farmers, including David Rockefeller, Ted Turner, and a dozen companies on the Fortune 500 list. In Mexico as well, 85% of agricultural subsidies go to the largest 15% of farmers. What is crucial from the standpoint of understanding the role of prices in the economy is that persistent surpluses are as much a result of keeping prices artificially high as persistent shortages are of keeping prices artificially low. Nor were the losses simply the sums of money extracted from the taxpayers or the consumers for the benefit of agricultural corporations and farmers. These are internal transfers within a nation, which do not directly reduce the total wealth of the country. The real losses to the country as a whole come from the misallocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. Scarce resources such as land, labor, fertilizer, and machinery are needlessly used to produce more food than the consumers are willing to consume at the artificially high prices decreed by the government. All the vast resources used to produce sugar in the United States are wasted when sugar can be imported from countries in the tropics, where it is produced much more cheaply in a natural environment more conducive to its growth. Poor people, who spend an especially high percentage of their income on food, are forced to pay far more than necessary to get the amount of food they receive, leaving them with less money for other things. Those on food stamps are able to buy less food with those stamps when food prices are artificially inflated. From a purely economic standpoint, it is working at cross purposes to subsidize farmers by forcing food prices up and then subsidize some consumers by bringing down their particular costs of food with subsidies, as is done in both India and the United States. However, from a political standpoint, it makes perfect sense to gain the support of two different sets of voters, especially since most of them do not understand the full economic implications of the policies. Even when agricultural subsidies and price controls originated during hard times as a humanitarian measure, they have persisted long past those times because they developed an organized constituency which threatened to create political trouble if these subsidies and controls were removed or even reduced. Farmers have blocked the streets of Paris with their farm machinery when the French government showed signs of scaling back its agricultural programs or allowing more foreign farm produce to be imported. In Canada, farmers protesting low wheat prices blocked highways and formed a motorcade of tractors to the capital city of Ottawa. While only about 1/10 of farm income in the United States comes from government subsidies, about half of farm income in South Korea comes from such subsidies, as does 60% in Norway. The politics of price controls. Simple as basic economic principles may be, their ramifications can be quite complex, as we have seen with the various effects of rent control laws and agricultural price support laws. However, even this basic level of economics is seldom understood by the public, which often demands political solutions that turn out to make matters worse. Nor is this a new phenomenon of modern times in democratic countries. When a Spanish blockade in the 16th century tried to starve Spain's rebellious subjects in Antwerp into surrender, the resulting high prices of food within Antwerp caused others to smuggle food into the city, even through the blockade, enabling the inhabitants to continue to hold out. However, the authorities within Antwerp decided to solve the problem of high food prices by laws fixing the maximum price to be allowed to be charged for given food items and providing severe penalties for anyone violating those laws. There followed the classic consequences of price control: a larger consumption of the artificially lower-priced goods and a reduction in the supply of such goods, since suppliers were less willing to run the risk of sending food through the Spanish blockade without the additional incentive of higher prices. Therefore, the net effect of price control was that the city lived in high spirits until all at once provisions gave out, and Antwerp had no choice but to surrender to the Spaniards. Halfway around the world, in 18th century India, a local famine in Bengal brought a government crackdown on food dealers and speculators, imposing price controls on rice. Here, the resulting shortages led to widespread deaths by starvation. However, when another famine struck India in the 19th century, now under the colonial rule of British officials and during the heyday of free market economics, opposite policies were followed, with opposite results. In the earlier famine, one could hardly engage in the grain trade without becoming amenable to the law. In 1866, respectable men in vast numbers went into the trade. For the government, by publishing weekly returns of the rates in every district, rendered the traffic both easy and safe. Everyone knew where to buy grain cheapest and where to sell it dearest, and food was accordingly bought from the districts which could best spare it and carried to those which most urgently needed it. As elementary as all this may seem, in terms of economic principles, it was made possible politically only because the British colonial government was not accountable to local public opinion. In an era of democratic politics, the same actions would require either a public familiar with basic economics or political leaders willing to risk their careers to do what needed to be done. It is hard to know which is less likely. Politically, price controls are always a tempting quick fix for inflation, and certainly easier than getting the government to cut back on its own spending that is often behind the inflation. It may be considered especially important to keep the prices of food from rising. Accordingly, Argentina put price controls on wheat in the early 21st century. Predictably, Argentine farmers reduced the amount of land that they planted with wheat, from 15 million acres in 2000 to 9 million acres in 2012. Since there is a large international market for wheat, where the price is higher than the price permitted domestically in Argentina, the government also found it necessary to block wheat exports that would have made the domestic wheat shortage worse. The greater the difference between free market prices and the prices decreed by price control laws, the more severe the consequences of price control. In 2007, Zimbabwe's government responded to runaway inflation by ordering sellers to cut prices in half or more. Just a month later, the New York Times reported, Zimbabwe's economy is at a halt. It detailed some specifics. Bread, sugar, and cornmeal, staples of every Zimbabwean's diet, have vanished, seized by mobs who denuded stores like locusts in wheat fields. Meat is virtually non-existent, even for members of the middle class who have money to buy it on the black market. Gasoline is nearly unobtainable. Hospital patients are dying for lack of basic medical supplies. Power blackouts and water cutoffs are endemic. As with price controls in other times and places, price controls were viewed favorably by the public when they were first imposed in Zimbabwe. Ordinary citizens initially greeted the price cuts with a euphoric and short-lived shopping spree, according to the New York Times. Both the initial reactions and the later consequences were much as they had been in Antwerp centuries earlier. When a local area is devastated by a hurricane or some other natural disaster, many people consider it unconscionable if businesses in that area suddenly raise the prices of such things as bottled water, flashlights, or gasoline, or if local hotels double or triple the prices of their rooms,